The day I don't check it is the day that it's gonna, not do the right thing.
Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Tom Nardi.
This is episode 294, SAO badge reveal, precision on a shoestring, and the saga of Redbox. This week in Hackaday news, Supercon is a week and a bit away. We finally got the info on our Supercon SAO badge out. Put up the repository. The software is still work in progress, but all the hardware is there if you need to plan to do something along with that.
Or not, because we focus so much on the SAOs that maybe you don't have to do anything for the badge this year. Although I'm sure people still will. There still is like the header on the back, so you can attach hardware to it if you so choose.
No, two of the SAOs are basically prototyping spaces. So, they are the prototyping space on the badge. One of them is just basically straight up breaks out the pins. So, I don't know, you got some GPIOs to play with, you got power. I guess you have the I2C bus too, if you're feeling like it. The other is also prototyping space, but with an I2C capable microcontroller on it. So you can do easier, fancier stuff. Like, I don't know, put a potentiometer on it and connect that up to the rest of the badge. This badge is all about the SAOs. This badge is the SAOs. The inside centerpiece of the badge is really just a microcontroller to talk to all the SAOs. So it's all about hacking the SAOs and plugging them in.
That was the idea, right? I think it has kind of come together like we hoped. It was always from the start that, how do you focus on SAOs? Well, you take everything else away and then leave that as the remainder, and they'll have no choice but to make SAOs.
That's right. I mean, it's kind of a cop-out, right? Like, normally if we'd had a badge with a bunch of prototyping space on it, or like you say, a bunch of pin headers, we'd do that. But this one, it's just the pin headers are in the form of an SAO badge.
I think that the cool part is that, it's always dangerous to say with this audience who knows. I would say that the vast majority of the SAOs would be usable on next year's badge and beyond. That it's hard to imagine anything that they would do that would require this particular badge to function, because we haven't changed the spec or anything. It's still power, it's I2C and 2 GPIO. So
we changed the name.
We changed the name.
Supercon add-on.
Yeah, not the acronym though. We didn't. It wouldn't go too far.
Well, I mean, we're not going to confuse everybody.
But, like in previous years, we've seen incredible stuff made to hook up to the badge, but it was a one-time thing because the nature of the badge changes every year, right? So I think it will be cool that all the work done for the SAOs this year will absolutely apply to not even just next Supercon, but other cons that use the SAO. There's been plenty of badges from DEF CON and Hope and stuff that use it. So I think that's the cool part, is that all the stuff being done here is going to have a life beyond this one event, which is always, I think it's kind of something we always strive for.
Yeah, because there's this whole community and infrastructure built around this. Got to use that. And like you say, it means that if you make something really cool on one of the prototyping ones, you can put it on something next year or the year after or the year after. You haven't gotten to play with it yet, but the touch wheel one from Toddbot is really fun to play with. It's it's like the controls of those old iPods, right? Like it's a scrolly, roundy wheel thing, and that's super fun to play with. And dead easy to incorporate into, a project on this badge or a project on whatever you have next that you want a touch wheel on. I mean, it's an SAO, I guess, but it could also be just you provide a 6-pin header and you can add a capacitive touch scrolly wheelie thing to your next project for free. I mean, first off, we hope that everybody's going to bring cool SAOs to the game. But second, that the modularity of it gives it some legs afterwards. And, if this piece isn't useful, then that piece will be. And you can have some fun with it.
We've seen some really cool SAOs in the contest, although obviously the stuff in the contest isn't necessarily the only stuff we're going to see at Supercon, and vice versa, right? There's presumably some people who have entered who won't be there physically. I really want to see, once these people also get in the same room, like what kind of interactivity can be accomplished between the SAOs, and that kind of had to wait until everybody is there and can talk to each other and say, hey, well, yours does this, well, mine does this. Can we have them talk across the badge? I think that's really going to be cool. like you said, we have the wheel, right? The control wheel thing that they're going to be getting. So, like, there's a bunch of SAOs proposed that could benefit from some physical controls. So, I'm hoping we'll see that kind of thing. People say, "Oh, wow, okay, now I have an I2C input device, and my SAO is an output device. So, like, let's write that glue code to stick them together and really maximize this modularity."
That's the plan. That's the plan. We'll see how it goes.
Which I think is going to be a learning experience for all of us, frankly, because I don't think it's completely known what's going to happen when all these different SAOs are plugged into each other. I think there's definitely the potential for mischief and conflicts and all kinds of stuff. I mean, we had so much debate about just like the pull-up resistors and stuff. So it's going to be interesting.
I've got one SAO in my collection that completely hoses the I2C bus. And I don't know what it's doing exactly, but whatever it is, when I plug that one in, none of the others work.
Well, we should say we have two buses, right? So, worst case scenario,
that's right. You can hose one and unhose the other. Exactly. Plug it in on the one side all by itself, and you're done. Anyway, enough badge talk. Let's head on over to What's That Sound?
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
This week is a let's hear what you guys guessed week. Last week I played the sound for the first time. Christina did not get it. We'll give Tom a chance, see what he does.
I've been dreading this all week because I listened to last week's podcast and
oh no,
I have no idea what that is. I mean, I'll listen to it again now if you want, but I mean, I think she said some kind of a test tone, and that was like that's the only thing I had to, honestly. When you went away on vacation, you're like, don't do anything too hard when you do the guess the sound thing. So I tried to give him a softball, and then you come out with something like this. Oh man, I mean, it almost sounded like Mary Had a Little Lamb at first, but then and I thought maybe some kind of a modem or something. But the only reason I'm saying like a test tone is just it kind of steps through. It seems like it's going through a progression of pitches or something. But I got nothing. It's kind of a scary for Halloween. It's kind of a spooky, scary noise.
Maybe spookier and scarier than you realize. It is the HAARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
Oh, wow.
Which was a super high power radio that was broadcasting up at the ionosphere to try to further ionify it. And they were playing around. And when I say they, I guess I mean the Air Force and the Navy were playing around with ionized parts of the upper atmosphere to make radio bounce off of them more or less doable. There may be some secret projects that it was for, but there's also a lot of open science on the ionosphere done with it. And since sometime 2015, it's actually been given over to the University of Alaska, and they run it and do pure research with it. The fun part is that some conspiracy theory people think that it's used for a weather control and weather manipulation research for, total world domination. Wahaha. I can't speak to that.
Yeah, we're not sure about that part. I was wondering if you were going to mention that. As soon as you said HAARP, I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah, right?
We're going to get some comments now.
Of course. It's shocking how much power and how little power it puts out. Like I was looking into it, and it's compared to like the sun, it doesn't barely do any ionizing of the upper atmosphere. But compared to any radio that you've got, it puts out a hell of a lot of power. So it's kind of interesting.
It's fun how much stuff that we have starts with the military just messing around. Like we built this installation just to mess around, but you guys can have it. We're done with it.
Right.
Feel free to conduct more open science with it.
Oh yeah, boy, if you go down the Wikipedia page and start looking into some of the conspiracy theories, they're pretty solid. Jesse Ventura went up there to try to get on site because he wanted to see if it was manipulating the weather or bombarding people with mind-controlling radio waves.
Do you think there'd be a big button that says, like, world domination? Like, if he got up there, how would you know if they were manipulating, you know what I mean? Like, what would be the visual indicator that they're manipulating the weather?
turn the mind control knob up to 7. Now
right.
turn it up to 8.
Look, here it is.
They actually do have annual open house days. He probably could have just gone up there on one of those and he would have gotten in.
Well, they cover up all the mind control and weather.
But that's the day they
stuff.
cover it.
They put a big sheet over it, so you can't see it.
That's the day they cover it up. Yeah, they erase the thing that says mind control and make it say...
It's just a whiteboard that is, they erase it. Like, no, that's not what we're doing today.
I mean, I don't know. It definitely was doing some top secret something for a while, and that for sure. But, it's probably research on radio propagation to submarines or something, A, useful, and B, that you don't want everybody to know about. So who knows? Anyway, enough BS. Not super many people got this one. We had, only 10 answers. Of them, 5 are correct, so 50%. Wrong ones were awesome. One was like a fax machine not quite connecting. That's pretty good.
I definitely had like kind of a modem vibe of it.
Yeah, bunch of test frequencies. And of course, the tonal phrase that gets you abducted by aliens from Bear Lodge. Close Encounters. Sadly, no, nobody gets abducted. It's just ionosphering. Anyway, 5 people got the right answer. Here goes a die roll. And the answer is 1. Congratulations to I Can See the Sounds. Harp, maybe. At least the frequencies match. Correcto. I'll be getting in touch with you and get you a Hackaday Podcast t-shirt. Next week, What's That Sound? And probably most of the Hackaday Podcast will be taking a week off. We're all going to be at Supercon, and it is just impossible to get anything done while Supercon is going on. So Hackaday Podcast and What's That Sound on a break next week, but we'll see you the week after.
Maybe we'll hear some sounds during Supercon we can use.
Oh, dude. Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll definitely try to record something. We'll definitely get some samples from Supercon. Whether What's That Sound or just people being goofy. So let's start up the hacks. My first one this week comes from Chris Borga, a 3D printed open source lathe. Yeah, I guess it is, kinda. Although my comments in the show notes here are more like a concrete lathe in a 3D printed case. And that is not at all a bad thing.
It's probably a better thing.
It's absolutely a better thing. And that's kind of why we picked it, is because it's an absolutely beautiful construction. It's got some 2020 in there for kind of providing straightness, and it's got some bolts for keeping the whole thing structurally sound and under tension. But the exterior is entirely 3D printed, and then he upends it and fills it with concrete. And that gives it both the weight that it needs to not be a vibratory mess and the strength that it needs to take the kind of forces it has to hold. And I think that's a brilliant idea. And it's not the first machine tool that's been built out of concrete, or we'll talk about epoxy granite in a few minutes, but it is the first one I've ever seen where the mold for that is 3D printed. And I thought that was actually really interesting. It's a small tabletop lathe, and I don't think it's quite complete yet. Like, it's got headstock, but it doesn't have a good jaw on it yet. It's got a tailstock, of course, but it doesn't have a cross slide. Well, it's got a little rest, so it's more like a little wood lathe or something. But in the video, he's turning aluminum on it. So, I mean, aluminum's kind of the wood of metal, but he gets the job done.
Pretty daring to be using hand tools, just like sticking them into a spinning piece of metal. Bad things could occur, but like you said, aluminum's, I guess, forgiving enough that bends to your will rather than throwing the tool in your face. But yeah, it's a really cool method, and I don't know if he had mentioned it, but he's been doing stuff in this style for a while, different kind of little shop tools, and was working way up to this. So it's kind of a method that has been developed over a couple of different things, and I think it makes a lot of sense. You can print the mold, and I mean, I guess it's not a mold per se because it never comes off, right? Like it's
right. It's a case
it's a case, right? It's not like you're pumping out these things. Like you'll flip it over, you'll fill it full of concrete, and then you don't actually see. You imagine somebody trying to pick this thing up off the table or move it. It's full of concrete. It would be a little deceptive like that. But yeah, he had done other little desktop stuff and said, okay, well, that works. So let me do it bigger. And yeah, why not? We've definitely seen I think somebody was making like they were using like actual blocks of granite and were like shaping them down or something. I think they had like casts off from.
Hold up, there's Mario jumping in your room.
Mario is jumping.
What was that?
Oh hell, it could be my phone. I can't hear it because I have my headphones on.
It could easily be your phone.
We've definitely had somebody making machine tools out of like cast off pieces of marble. I think they were like nearby to somewhere that made countertops and were able to get chunks of marble for cheap, and they were using those. I mean, it's not far off, right, to just pour concrete and do it that way. So I think there's a lot of promise. What I was impressed with was he was talking about less than $100 total for all the parts, which is a pretty impressive accomplishment, because you can buy one of these little lathes, for Harbor Freight or whatever, for not a whole lot anyway. When I looked at it and was watching the video, I was like, okay, but it's gonna have to be really cheap for me to do this work rather than just buy one of these little cheapies. And it is cheap enough, so consider me intrigued.
I still would buy the cheapo from Harbor Freight. I've used one of those, and they're actually really great. I won't cast any shade on them. So one thing that's really cool is that part of the 3D print / concrete methodology is that he can put a lot of hardware in it. Things get bolted here, and there are lots of attachment points buried in the concrete / attached to the plastic. It's a really cool design idea to do this sort of thing, and I really, really like that. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe if it was a benchtop lathe, maybe I would buy the Harbor Freight one. But this idea, this principle can expand out to a bunch of other things. And like I said, we've seen people make really amazing quality machines out of epoxy granite, and it's basically the same story. You just are using rocks and a binder for their mass. I guess all the examples we've seen, and I'll throw a couple good links in the show notes here, have been using sand and epoxy in like an 80-20 mix, and just pouring it into a basically squarey kind of blocky mold made up of plywood, basically, right? Like, it's not an interesting shaped mold. And I think that's what's kind of cool about this technique, is that he's got an arbitrarily complex and interesting shaped mold to go with it. And so he can make the machine already into the final shape he wants, and then pour, in this case, cement in. But you could do it also with epoxy granite and have something really dimensionally stable that way. Yeah, I guess I just think it's a really cool technique, and one that we should think about. And the idea of it being a mold, but like you said, it's a mold that you don't remove the mold from in the end, because it looks good on the outside anyway. That's pretty valuable too.
So this next one, I've been kind of keeping an eye on, because I think it's a fascinating story. If you haven't heard Redbox, you should rewind a little bit. If you haven't heard of Redbox, which is possible, it was a service where you could go and rent discs. What a quaint idea! You would rent the disc, and it would spit it out of this vending machine, and you could watch it and put it back in the vending machine the next day. And it was an improvement over Blockbuster and such, because you didn't have to talk to anybody, and there were these machines all over the place, right? Like they were common in grocery stores, that kind of deal. Netflix ate their lunch, as you can imagine, and the company has folded very recently. I think in the last couple weeks. Surprised they held on as long as they did, frankly. So the company folded very suddenly, as these things tend to happen, and there are now thousands of these machines just out in the wild, and it is unclear like who's going to dispose of them and what's going to happen. And I think you could probably see where we're going with this. There's a very interesting potential here. So in this particular case, so this is a video from Smoking Silicon, who apparently just like saw some of these Redbox kiosks out there and just started playing around with them to see like what will they do in absence of the mothership, because like all the infrastructure is already shut down, like the servers and stuff. The interesting thing was like they all didn't respond the same way, which seems really weird. Like some just said, no, I can't help you, something's wrong. Other ones were willing to spit out discs, probably for free, because it's not like the company's in a position to be charging your card or anything. So he recommended just trying to go to some of these machines and seeing if they'll give you free movies. And I think they expanded into games too, actually. which could be even more lucrative if it's going to give out free discs. This is kind of cool for now. If you can get the free discs out of them act now while supplies are. But I'm really curious about the machines themselves and what's going to happen with them. And, I have, separate from this video, like I said, I've been kind of keeping an eye on this. And there was some talk that people just went to like the local grocery store and was like, hey, those guys are out of business, right? Can I take that machine? And they were like, please, because what are they going to do with them? I mean, these things are, if you haven't seen one, they're giant. I mean, they're probably 2-3 times the size of like a regular soda vending machine, because they had to hold all the DVDs, and they got, one section is just the touch screen, and they're massive. And these stores don't want to have to deal with them, and they certainly don't want this dead eyesore in the front of their building. So it could be kind of like this Wild West in the next few months, where just grab them if you can grab them, because nobody's gonna miss them. In other words, I mean, I think we're beyond the point where like there's gonna be some kind of angel investor that comes in and saves Redbox. Like, I think that's done. Like, so it could just be, if you see one of these things outside your local store, see if they're aware of what's happened with the company, and maybe you could walk away with a really interesting device to hack on.
There's been, in the last week, I guess, Foon has figured out that these have customer data on them. And she must have picked one up and started looking through the hard drive from it. And she found out that, for instance, on the one that she was looking at, that it had, about 2,500 transactions on the disk image. That includes things like customers' email addresses, zip codes, what they were renting, first and last digits of their credit card number, although not the whole credit card number. So I think you probably couldn't just steal their stuff, but definitely personally identifiable information that you do not want out there. I mean, I'm stoked if people are picking these machines up to reuse them.
But yeah, please don't steal anybody's information off them.
But if you do, could you please just nuke the hard drive? Because then you won't be doing anything wrong, because this is a little bit sketchy.
From that angle, I would at least trust the local hacker. I'd rather see these machines go into the hands of curious nerds than mustache twirling villains, if that makes sense,
Absolutely.
Maybe it's a race against time to see who can get these machines first. It's going to be people with ill intent, or people who just look for a big box of interesting hardware.
It raises a really interesting / horrible question. When a big company like this goes bankrupt, who's responsible for the security debacle that they leave behind them?
Wah, wah.
And yeah, exactly. Thanks, people. The security angle on this is really ugly, but the, robot DVD server angle on it is pretty awesome. So I'm kind of torn.
Well, it kind of reminds me in a way of, several years ago, I had the opportunity to get into a Toys R Us that had closed down. And,
oh, yeah.
I went in there to grab anything electronic that I could, and in the process uncovered that they had left all of the employees' records just laying around with like copies of their driver's license and social security cards and stuff. And it was the same deal. Like, the company, Toys R Us had gone belly up, and no one was being held responsible. So they just did nothing. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens, and I think you're much more likely to have your information compromised through something like this than hacker. You know what I mean? Like, that's the sad reality, is just your stuff being mishandled by a company that doesn't care or doesn't exist anymore is just as likely to get you in trouble as anything else.
All right. Next up comes from the Libra Space Foundation. The article we wrote about it is Libra Space Foundation aims to improve satellite tech. And this is particularly focusing on a new satellite deployment mechanism they've got. So this is for CubeSats, right? And they all fit in basically a square cross-section tube, and they're held together with a spring, and the flap opens, and they all just get pushed out into space when they get deployed. And that's kind of the whole trick with the satellite launcher. The Libra Space Foundation has their own satellite launcher design. It's called the PicoBus. It's actually a lot lighter than previous designs, and there's been a lot of work on it, et cetera, et cetera. Part of this work that I thought was really interesting, and that's what we featured in this article, was a simulator to simulate the multi-body dynamics in zero gravity. So, you need to design this spring-loaded box to push all your satellites out. How much force do you need? Where do you put this force so that the satellites don't tumble as they come flying out, et cetera, et cetera? This is the sort of thing that you would want to simulate pretty accurately on the ground before you send it up to space. And so that's what this is about, is a couple people from LSF and a couple people working with a solver company called Oncell got together. The reason we're talking about this on Hackaday is that all of this is open source work. And what's really funny, of course, is that Oncell incorporates basically all of their really cool solver tech into the open source FreeCAD desktop environment. And so if you need to do some zero gravity multi-body dynamics solving, fire up FreeCAD and just use the multi-body dynamics library. It's there now, which is, it's lovely. Like, I think one of the complaints about FreeCAD is it's got so many weird workbenches in it that, like, it's really confusing when you just start. You're just like, I just want to 3D print a rubber duck. Why do I have this module that's capable of designing a launcher for CubeSats? And the answer is open source. That's why, damn it. Because it's awesome to have a robot dynamics solver, and it's awesome to have, finite element analysis, and it's awesome to have zero gravity physics simulators. And God, they have an architecture model in FreeCAD that'll blow your mind. You're never going to design a house, but if you are an architect, there you go, you've got it. Anyway, this is the newest crazy ass module in FreeCAD, courtesy of Libre Space Foundation. We've covered them before. They have flown, I guess we have an article back from 2017, their first open source satellite. I'll throw the links in there. They're actually a spin-off of SatNogs, which was a global satellite tracking network. So, a bunch of amateurs get together, share their data and time on small home-built satellite trackers. And they actually won the very first ever Hackaday prize back in 2014. So in some weird way, Libre Space Foundation is kind of the great-great-grandchild of the very first Hackaday prize ever, because SatNogs won it, and then they took the money and took it to town and formed this broader Libre Space. So I think it's absolutely lovely and really cool to see them continuing to push the open source software and open space science stuff.
And SatNogs is still a thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know they still, and in fact, I've seen it pop up in the wild occasionally. People will mention it. At the time, it seemed like, what's the application for this, and now
right.
a decade later, literally, right? There's like this ridiculous number of satellites, and okay, like now it makes sense. Okay, now I get it. Like, this is so I think they did a good job of maybe predicting the rise of like the CubeSat and the current low cost relatively of space launches that we currently enjoy, because now, I mean, everybody's shooting up these little satellites, and a distributed non-governmental ground station network is actually very handy to have. So I've seen a couple projects say, hey, we're using SatNogs to pick up the signal from the CubeSat we're launching. So it's just really cool to like see it all kind of come together finally.
Yeah, go over to the Libre Space Foundation GitLab page if you haven't, and just check out the different groups that are all working on kind of similar goals there. There are, rocketry groups, there are tracking groups, there are dynamics groups, there are, identification and localization groups, people working on the radio front, people working on the hardware that goes up there. Everything about CubeSats and doing them on an amateur and open basis is up there, and I think that is really, really rad. One more step in this whole, I think it's a giant movement at this point.
Groups like this are going to help pave the way and open up access to space, because one part of it is, it was ridiculously expensive to get up there. Now that's starting to change, but there's still, the fact that you need to do this kind of modeling for something that is, quote unquote, as simple as shooting out a satellite with a spring, like, space is hard. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you need to know. And if everybody has to reinvent the wheel, it's going to just hinder progress. So doing this kind of stuff in the open and documenting it is going to be a huge benefit, because realistically it's only going to get cheaper to get access to space, for better or for worse. We're going to start seeing more and more weird crap in orbit, but that's, inevitable. That's the cost of progress, I suppose. But movements like this hopefully will help save some people the trouble of launching something that doesn't work, because, hey, we already have that documented, and you can just download our design and you don't have to figure it out on your own. All right, well, my next one here is it's kind of interesting from almost a historical in the sense of the internet, I should say, and not like, Roman Colosseums or anything. We're only talking the 90s, but that's still pretty far for the internet. This is called Keeping Tabs on Undergraduate Projects Labs d'Azur status. This is basically University of Wisconsin's Undergraduate Projects Lab, UPL. Since at least the 90s, it looks like, this is the very early days of the internet, they always had some way that students could see if anybody was there, basically, without having to go there. You'd go on the webpage in 98 and you'd see this little grainy picture and you'd say, oh, there's two people there. Let me put my pants on and go join them. Or there's nobody there, so I'll stay where I'm at. A little bit of this write-up is how they pulled that off back in the 90s, which was no mean feat. Reading about apparently it was an actual VCR somehow in the mix. Like there was a camera hooked up to a VCR, which was then hooked up to a Mac, and then another machine would FTP to the Mac to get the image, and sometimes that didn't work, and it was all held together with strings. But just having a live webcam image on a web page in the 90s was pretty cool, right? Obviously, the state of technology has moved on a bit since then, and there's more advanced tools that they're bringing to bear on this problem. So that goes into the more modern incarnation, which is using webcam, and it's doing computer vision to pick out people from the background, and then that was tied into like a Python script that would update their Discord server and say, hey, there's 8 people in the room, or there's 5 people in the room. And that was working pretty well, except there was, as probably anyone who's worked with like this kind of low-end computer vision can attest, there was false positives. And even in the picture posted on the write-up, there's like a chair that it says, hey, here's a person, so you would have the system think a chair or a book bag was a person in an otherwise empty room and was producing fictitious information. So that kind of defeats the purpose, right? The other problem was that it would see people in there and advertise, hey, come hang out, there's people in the lab. But sometimes the lab is used for like meetings and stuff, where the fact that there's 6 people in there does not actually mean they want you to come and bound in there with your latest project, because they're trying to talk about something unrelated. So it was not a perfect solution. Kind of the final chapter that brings us up to speed is that Andrew Moses, who did the write-up, looked at how a similar lab was doing it at MIT, and they using door sensors, right? Because basically, if the door's open, come in. If the door's closed, probably stay home. Open door, literally and figuratively kind of thing. So the actual solution ended up being a lot easier. You don't need to count how many people are in there. If the door's closed, whether or not there's people in there, then it's not time to come. And if the door's open, then come on down. So then the article kind of goes into that, and how the door was tied into Home Assistant and all that kind of stuff. One thing I did think was interesting, reading this whole thing, there's one kind of line in the write-up where Andrew was like, I don't know how to solder, so I have to use all these off-the-shelf modules. And that kind of struck me. I was surprised at first, like, well, you don't know how to solder. But it also was kind of cool that you could pull all this stuff off now. With there's so many modules you could just buy and just hook together, and you don't need to, as much as it pains me to admit, that is, soldering is not like the end all be all for this kind of stuff anymore. Like there's so much stuff out there that's just turnkey, and it's a matter of putting the right firmware on it and writing the necessary couple lines of Python to get one thing talking to the other. So yeah, it's just a cool story that really goes. It almost follows like the trajectory of hackerdom in a way, where it starts with this crazy solution that involved all this stuff tied together, and ends with I bought a couple modules on AliExpress and wrote a few lines of code, and I was able to do the same thing without even having to warm up my non-existent soldering iron.
Their initial solution was the most hackerspace solution ever. Like, we wanted to do RFID things and we wanted to do motion sensors. And I love that they're doing YOLO and actually counting the number of people in a computer vision model. Like, the question is, do you want to have people over or not? And like, it could be as simple a user interface as a switch, right? You know, are the lights on? Or like you
Oh, yeah,
said,
right.
in the end, it's the door. And the door's even better, right? Because you can still leave the lights on, but close the door. And the user interface there is so intuitive. Everybody closes the door when they don't want people to walk through the doorway. It's such a lame solution from a hacker perspective. It doesn't involve like a Mac 2 with a video grabber card and an FTP to a central computer somewhere. Like, there's nothing held together with string and duct tape. It's actually just a simple, reasonable solution. but
Oh,
but I really like that actually too, because it's good. Every once in a while, it's good to do the simple thing that works. Well, this last project from me is diffraction limited DIY air bearings, no machining required. And this is an incredible video about making something super, super precise, but in the simplest ways possible. And I think that by itself is worth your time watching the video. The end goal here are air bearings, which are basically just flat discs that are so flat, and kind of when you put them on an equivalently flat surface, you could just put a little bit of air in between the two surfaces and they will float around on top of it with absolutely no friction whatsoever. The flatter you can get the little hockey pucks, and the flatter you can get the surface underneath them, the less volume of air you need to push through there. And in fact, you can do it with just static pressure if you get them really, really, really flat. And so then the question is, how do you get an infinitely flat surface? And the answer is you steal the precision from something that's already really, really flat. And in this case, Diffraction Limited is using a piece of float glass, which is, it's just a glass sheet, but glass sheets are surprisingly flat. He has a little metal hockey puck, but to make the bottom surface of it super flat, you would either have to do some incredibly high precision metal machining or do what he does. And that is make little 3D printed jigs that hold the pucks above a surface with 3 different screws. He can adjust the height, so he takes a couple sheets of paper to make it a very thin surface and then adjusts the height on there so that the pucks are just sitting on the piece of paper. He then uses JB Weld epoxy, smooshes it on the bottom of the puck, and then puts this in the jig against the surface of the glass. And what that does is it gives him an incredibly flat bottom surface that's very, very thin and a known distance above the surface. And it's absolutely fantastic. There's a lot of kind of extremely precision machining done here, but it's all done with very basic tools. The only thing he has that's at all critical for the success of the project is a few 3D printed jigs, a really flat piece of glass, and I think a fairly dialed in drill press. But that's about it. The rest of it is all kind of hand tools and just being clever and being careful. And I love that aspect of the project. He ends up making 3 of these, so it's kind of like an air-bearing tripod. And on the top of each one is a ball bearing, and then he builds a platform that sits on top of these that uses hex head screws that then sit on the balls and make kind of a ultra cheap kinematic mount. Like, go watch the video. If you're at all interested in mechanical design stuff, you will pick up a whole bunch of tidbits, even if you don't want to make air bearings. But air bearings are super, super, super cool as well.
I think my feelings on this one are kind of summed up with the first comment where somebody was like, I'm never going to make these things. But
Yeah.
but this is very enjoyable to watch somebody else do them. This is not necessarily something that everybody's going to need, but I love that it can be done, and I love that the information is out there, and it looks fascinating. I wish I had some kind of application for it, but that's not the point. I love things like this because it's pushing the envelope and doing things that you would think you can't pull off. We see a lot of that, I think, actually, with like high accuracy stuff in the home lab, kind of this idea that you can't pull off these kind of things without a bunch of machines and expensive equipment. And like you said, a decent drill press and some 3D printed parts, and it's amazing what you can accomplish.
Yeah, and this bizarro hyper flat surface that he gets out of the JB weld because he steals that hyper flat surface off of a piece of glass. He wants to quantify just how flat it is, and the way he does that is he takes a prism and he puts it down on it, and you could see a little interference pattern there, and the flatness of the surface is kind of proportional to how often you see the little rainbows in the interference pattern change over, as they move across the surface. And it is shockingly flat. Like, what's the wavelength of light, right? Like you're talking, he's got this thing down to kind of measurable numbers of nanometers of flatness across the whole thing. And he can verify it with nothing more complicated than a little prism, which is a pretty clever trick too. Like there's a whole bunch of really smart things here. And it reminded me of Dan Gelbart's work. And if you haven't seen his prototyping stuff, you absolutely should. I'll throw a link in. 40 Years of Mechanical Prototyping at Light Speed is a video series of his where he just goes through these ultra high precision machines that he makes. And actually, the air bearing part reminded me of a CNC lathe grinder machine that Dan Gelbart made, where his aim is to be able to grind parts to be so accurate that they fit into each other, but don't let air through, so that he can make air bearings, but they're static air bearings. Like you don't need to feed pressurized air into it. It's just such a tight fit that even just given the air in its little pocket, it can spin freely. They're amazing devices. Wow. But to make these, he had to make this machine to make them. Dan Gelbart is probably the master of borrowing precision where he needs it, because this machine, it needs to be super flat and super even. And so he buys some of these granite plates that are super flat and super even. And you can get these for a few $100, but they're flat to, again, nanometers. And then he builds the base to this by putting them on a known flat surface and gluing them down. And so when the epoxy hardens, they're also absolutely flat and parallel. And so he's got that going. And the only other super precision part in this machine is the bearings on the spindle and on the grinder that he uses. And those he gets used from a IC fabrication machine of some sort or other. So, and this kind of harkens back to that first build we had, the first kind of ghetto lathe. The only parts that need to be super, super precise in that are the bearings, so that it doesn't have any run out, and some parts of it need to be flat and the machine needs to be, solid, right? And so here Gelbart is just buying these bearings that cost him, again, $100, $200 each. But you combine those with a couple plates that are dead flat, and for about $1,000, you've got a machine that can do nanometer precision grinding. Like, it's amazing. And so I guess I see this DIY air bearings as kind of the little brother of some of the Dan Gelbart work. Here, all of the precision he gets in this is from a well-designed jig, the thickness of a couple sheets of paper, and then the absolute flatness of a piece of glass when you put JB weld on it. So pretty damn sweet. Bootstrapping.
Well, I picked this last one because, I think we kind of all have I2C on the brain right now with the badge and the SAOs. One of the things we saw a little bit of, especially after the bad reveal, I2C's tricky, I don't want to deal with that, and that kind of thing. And this article, I2C the hard way, shows that this doesn't have to be as difficult as you might think it is. And this is about literally communicating with an I2C device by just pushing buttons to control the data and clock lines. And while I would not recommend anybody do this for their SAOs, I would love to see it if they want to try. The trick here is that the clock rate doesn't need, apparently, to be any kind of a normal clock rate. It can be whatever you want, so long as they're synchronized. And this kind of reminds me of Ben Eater's 6502 computer, where the clock rate is just how whatever speed you want to push the clock button at. it can go instruction by instruction. You just press it once and it goes to the next thing. And that brings it all down to like a human level where you could just advance the clock and see things happen and see the commands go through. So it's sort of a similar idea to that. If you're curious about how I2C devices communicate, I think this is probably a great way to humanize it a little bit. I think so many of us have used I2C stuff, and it's, okay, you got a sensor and you have a library and you get the data out of it and you don't really give it much more thought, right? And that's one of the things that I'm kind of excited about seeing with the SAOs at Supercon is I think it's going to get people more thinking about how I2C actually works and how do you read and write and that kind of stuff on a lower level than they're probably used to. And I think there's a lot of value in getting people out of their comfort zone and getting them to really understand something they have been working with at kind of a surface level before. This is just more resources for that. So definitely a cool video to check out if you've ever wondered what happens behind the scenes when you run that command in your library that pulls the temperature data from a sensor, like what's actually happening and how you could perhaps bend that to your will.
Yeah, I think there's something always charming about doing these kind of clock serial communications by hand. Like, I really do like it. It somehow drives it home that, the clock signal is really just you pressing and releasing a button. The other one, you set the data to the value you want, and then you press the button, and then you set it to the next one, and then you release it, right? Or I don't know what your phase and polarity is, but it's not rocket science in a sense, right? Like, on the other hand, I'm right now still debugging parts of the badge where one of the two I2C devices is holding the clock line low. And the problem with I2C is you can do that. The lines float up, they're pulled up by resistors, and the devices communicate by pulling them down. So everybody's got a transistor that they pull the line down with, and then they let go of it and it floats back up. If one device isn't playing game and they just pull the line down all the time, that's the end of your I2C bus. And that's where I'm at right now. I'll have it figured out by Supercon. But, So watching this video, I'm like, somebody in my device here is not letting their finger off the button, and it's driving me crazy. Well, my first quick hack of the week comes from Excessive Overkill. This is 3D printed tires by the numbers. It's an investigation into which method of making DIY tires for a remote control car is the best. And the by the numbers part refers to the fact that he makes some test stands to test these out on. And so he's got custom urethane tires, he's got straight up PLA tires, he's got tires with TPU, and then he sprays one with a rubber sealant thing. What's it called? One of these infomercial rubber sealants. We don't have it here in Germany.
Flex Seal?
That's the one. Yeah, and so one of the tires is coated with Flex Seal. And when he puts these on the test stand, actually the Flex Seal one is the grippiest. When you put weight on it, it holds the most of all of them. But then he finally takes all the tires outside and does kind of a real world acceleration and how well does this drive on grass and on concrete test. And it turns out actually the urethane tires do a lot better and the Flex Seal actually does horribly in the real world. So this is your reminder that test stands are awesome, but real world practice is also important. Next up, Jeremy Weatherford, 0 to custom macropad in 37 easy steps. 37 laughably simple steps. This is an epic 4-video long series of Jeremy's macropad build. And it covers everything you need to know about making a macropad, from the design aspect to the fabrication, to making sure the case fits, to getting the firmware right, to having it be exactly customized and as you like it. It's really interesting. I've never seen such the completeness of this documentation is really astounding. Maybe more than you want. But if you're looking to build a macropad or any kind of custom keyboard, you should probably give it a check. And last up, Christina Ernst, make your own Remy the Rat this Halloween. This is the funnest Halloween build I've seen in a while. It's a little rat that sits on a hairband on top of her head. His arms are driven by servos, and he holds her hair and he pulls her hair, driving her around and marionetting her arms. That's kind of funny, but the best part of this is that she has an IMU actually attached to her arm that controls the servo in the rat. She doesn't mimic the rat lifting up her arms. She moves her arms and the rat pulls her hair, but it absolutely makes the marionetting illusion work perfectly. I just love the backwardsness of the control system here, but it makes the illusion work perfectly.
So my first quick hack, I have give your SMD components a lift. This is probably not a hack at all, actually. This is more of a practical tip, but it's a very good one. This is a quick video from Mr. Solder Fix, who, as you may gather from the name, enjoys soldering and fixing things, and has put out a lot of practical videos on how to do just that. In this case, it is his method for safely lifting the pins on ICs in a way that you don't damage them and can put them back down in the future, which is occasionally necessary for debugging stuff. And that one of those little tricks of the trade that you should probably be familiar with. And this is a good way to figure out the best practice. Next up is 75-in-1 music. I really like this one because I think, like many people in the community, I started out with one of these, some number in one electronic project kits. They tended to get crazier and crazier. I think I had one that was like 5,001 at one point. And they do that because it's just a bunch of components with spring terminals, and they give you a bag of jumper wires, and you can pretty much make infinite combinations of circuits with those things at your disposal. In this case, Matthew North Music has grabbed a couple of these and are using them to make music. Again, you have all the components there, and it's just a matter of wiring up and making them do something cool. So in this case, one of them is kind of providing a tone through an oscillator, and the other one actually, perhaps cheating a little bit, it was a kit that was made with a little digital recording chip on there, so you can kind of do samples and play them back, which would not be something you could have done on any of the kits I had, but in any event, it's cool to see these electronic kits still being used and still popping up and doing cool stuff decades after they came out. And then my last one is figuring out the most efficient way to reuse bags of desiccant. I think anybody who has been 3D printing and has rolls of filament has run into this problem, or maybe not a problem, but you've wondered this. The bags of filament always have the little do not eat packs in there to suck up the moisture, and there's always a question, can they be reused, and how effective are they, and what kind of lifetime they have, and some of them can be heated to drive the moisture out of them, and they can be infinitely reused, while other ones are kind of a disposable option. So in this video, CNC Kitchen kind of goes through all that and looks at the different things you could do with them and makes some kind of, I don't know that there's any groundbreaking discoveries here, but it is interesting to see, in one case, you can get to the point where, like, if you are reusing an old little silica packet, that might actually be counterproductive. If you had, say you had two totally dried ones and then you put one in there that had been used and already had some moisture in it, the moisture can come out of that and go into your dry ones and end up being less effective than just having the two in the first place. So there's some interesting stuff in here, and if you've ever had the problem of filament absorbing water and not printing properly, this is definitely the kind of information that it's good to have in the back of your mind.
All right, that brings us to the Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week, I wanted to cover a recent kerfuffle. Will I/O domain names survive a geopolitical rearrangement? By Lewin Day. And about a week ago, everybody was concerned because the UK is giving over sovereignty of some islands in the Indian Ocean that they used to possess, giving them back to the people who live there, which is the right thing to do. The problem is that now this island belongs to Mauritius now, and the people who live there are called Chagosians. And what are we going to do with the British Indian Ocean Territory that officially had the .io domain name? If you read the popular press, there was some, oh my God, .io is going to go away pretty soon. The sky is falling type stuff. And I think Lewin lays it out pretty accurately here that, I mean, at the absolute least, the sky isn't going to fall for 5 years, but the sky may never fall if there's enough vested interest in keeping IO going. We got Hackaday IO. We're kind of worried about it continuing to go. So this kind of matters for us. The deal is the 2-letter domain names are all reserved for countries asterisk. And the asterisk is there's a whole bunch of them that are non-countries as well. And I think that's the grounds for hope that .io will continue to exist after the Indian Ocean Territory is given back to its rightful owners. For instance, and I think, and Lewin ends the article with this, the most glaring of them is that .su for the Soviet Union is still around, and you can get domain names there if you want. There hasn't been a Soviet Union for 30-something years now. So what's going on there? So Lewin dug up the table, and there are 242 officially assigned country names, but then there are 7 officially assigned that aren't necessarily countries, 13 exceptionally reserved. And that's where .su is, but where other non-countries like .un for the United Nations and .eu for the European Union, which isn't strictly a country at all. But also .uk, strangely enough. The official one for Great Britain is .gb, but when have you last used that? You always do .uk. And this tradition of having them be there is why they have maintained this kind of exceptionally reserved status. And there's 30 more of them that are indeterminately reserved, 7 that are transitionally reserved, and 320 that are unassigned. And that's the one that I think is really cool. I kind of want to make a country so that I can get .yp or something. Looking down the list, the X's are user assigned, free for assignment at the disposal of users. So .xa through .xz, bizarro. Anyway, the point of, long story short, the 2-letter country code domain names are country codes in name, but in very practical matters, if you have an important group of users or whatever who wants to continue to maintain it and they have a body somewhere that's willing to stand up for it, it looks like there's a good chance that it'll work. Myself, I'm not so worried about the future of Hackaday IO, but we'll see. The Soviet Union's got 30-something years on us.
The idea was, to make these for individual countries, but that never really panned out that way. I mean, I remember, every time a new one would pop up, the registrar I use would be like, "Hey, here's a new one. Come up with some weird domain names that use the." They were always just kind of advertised as like these fun, zany ways to do a domain, and they were never said like, "Oh, by the way, like you're supposed to actually be part of the government of whatever little country this 2-letter code represents." It was always just a free for all, and I think it's to try to rein that in now, just because one of the countries that it doesn't exist anymore. It just doesn't work. Especially something that is as popular as IO. I mean, obviously we have a vested interest, right? But there are many things I've seen out there with IO. So the chances of it actually going away, I think, are just not really even worth worrying about. It's going to be someone. Well, not us. Luckily, we don't have to do it. Someone with much deeper pockets would stand up if anything was really going to happen and secure it, make sure it still is viable. But yeah, I think even when we talked about this, you had mentioned the Soviet Union one. We know it's going to happen. It's not going to go away because none of the other ones have gone away. And but it's an interesting thought experiment, right? And it's interesting to look into the origins of these things and how they came about and all that kind of stuff, even if it's not really going to affect our day-to-day of it.
It could.
I mean, it could. I think it's possible, but
Yeah, I mean, with the Soviet Union example on one side, Lewin doesn't mention this, but Yugoslavia was another example. And when it split up into Serbia, Croatia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Northern Macedonia, and Slovenia, all of those got their own individual two-letter domain names, and they did actually abandon Yugoslavia.yu. But that's just because nobody wanted it anymore. So these things are kind of politically, or, it's not like there's a hard and fast rule, but they are determined by people at the end of the day, right? It's like, this is what the people want. YU is been removed from the list, right? And I think my guess is nobody wants IO to go away.
Right,
It would just piss a whole bunch of people off. So it's not going to go away.
pretty much wraps it up. It's not going to go away.
That's the summary.
That could have been the whole article. It's not going to go away.
That's
but,
it.
But it's good to look into it. Well, my can't miss this week is Hacker Tactic Building Blocks from Aria. And this is, we definitely talked about this exact thing in a previous episode of the podcast. And I'm glad to see it turned into a post. This is the idea of, you can buy modules, right, of all kinds of types these days, and we see people using those all the time. Why Aria has made the case in like a previous post, why re-implement a LiPo charging circuit and buy the parts and put them down, where you can buy these little modules for literal pennies and just put a footprint on your board. And obviously it's not always going to work out. I mean, if you're trying to make something super slim and to fit into something, you probably won't have that luxury. But if it's just something for your own purposes, you can buy a stack of these little LiPo charging boards and just reuse that footprint. And every time you want to have something battery powered, slap it down, and it saves you having to stock the little fiddly ICs and soldering them yourself. The next logical expansion of that, though, is to, well, why don't you just make your own modules and reuse those? And that is what this kind of article is about. And it kind of comes from a place of practicality to start with, because this all sort of goes back to her this long-term project where she wants to do a new board for the Sony Vaio handheld. And they were trying to work on the board, but there were some question marks about other parts, like, what in this case it was like the backlight driver and that kind of thing. And they said, well, we want to get this board out, but we're not really sure about this other part, and I don't want to hold off doing the board until we figure that out, and I don't want to screw that up. So let's just put a row of pin headers where the backlight driver will go, and we'll figure it out later, and let's get the boards made. And that kind of opens up a lot of flexibility, because, they're able to have the board put into production and done, and then kind of come back later and do the backlight driver on its own little board using, the easiest of footprints you could possibly do. I mean, there's already, whatever tool you're using is already going to have a row of header pins, of arbitrary size. Like that's going to be, if you don't have that footprint in the software, I'm not sure what you're doing. That's the most basic of footprints. So you don't have to worry about making sure like you lined up some castellated thing. You could make a row of pins, and then your little module has the matching pins, and they line up, and there's no just don't do it upside down. And I think it's a really cool idea, and it's something that I've kind of taken to heart a little bit when I'm designing my own stuff. Like she was talking about using like the modules that are off AliExpress. I do that, and I can certainly see doing something like this too. If I knew I wanted to implement something here, but I wasn't really sure how it was going to work or when I was going to do that, and I didn't need that part to proceed, right? We're trying to do things early, and that's something that's going to come down the line. Yeah, just make a row of pins, and you can come in later and drop whatever you want in there. And I think that's a really cool solution that doesn't involve any jumping through hoops, and that's always fun. You could one might call that a hack, in fact, where you're just abusing something for your own purposes and making your own life easier.
I love the way this started out as like here's the part of the circuit I don't want to design. I'm just going to leave that for later and put some headers on the board. I think that's fantastic. The other thing she does a couple times here is to design kind of commodity modules into a board with the idea of being able to remove them later if you want to improve on that. And so in her motivating example, it was, oh, I have to bodge in a power supply. But in, a different version of this would be, oh, I used the cheap $1 switching power converter, and later I find out I want a cleaner signal, so I design my own power converter. You use the same footprint for that, right? So that you've got the same module if you can make it fit in the same space. Damn it, we just saw a project like that this week. So I'll throw it in the links. Power supply PCB redesign. This was a crappy switching regulator switched out for a better one, but because Ian Carey, who was doing this, decided to make them both the same form factor. He basically copied the cheaper version's form factor for his new one. It was a plug-in replacement. And so all he had to do was redesign the nicer power supply. And I think that's pretty powerful too. So pretty quickly it gets into the standards battle, right? And you're like, which is the right footprint? Is this one the right connector? Is that one the right connector? I frankly don't know the answer to that one. I think the right connector is the one that matches the most number of things that you want it to match, right? And so the right module form factor is the one that fits the maximum number of other hackers projects out there. What that is at any given moment must change from year to year. So good luck with that one.
Well, I mean, just thinking about it, this is sort of like how the SAO was born, really.
Da 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 da.
Because I mean, what's a super common interface that we don't have to come up with some weird footprint for? You don't have to like source strange connectors because they're already in everybody's parts bin. And turns out a row of, industry standard spaced headers is the easiest way to do it. So this is just kind of taking that concept and implementing it at the board level and, not removable. Although could be removable, I suppose, if you really wanted to have a little Lego kind of board in your device where you can just pull these things out. I maybe
daughter boards, dude.
Yeah,
daughter
I guess for
boards.
Prototyping, sure, why not? I mean, she doesn't really take it in that direction in the article necessarily, but sure, if you're putting a row of header pins in there instead of soldering it directly in, you could put a socket, and then that you have the ability to swap out different versions of your little backlight circuit until you find the one that works properly, and then you can solder it down. So yeah, sure, I think that's a really cool idea too. I also like that, she mentions that if you're using, the standard header spacing, that means your little module is by its nature also breadboard compatible. So you could take your little module and stick it on a breadboard and poke around and experiment and get it working that way too. Again, without having to do anything extra. It just, at no extra charge, you have breadboard compatibility, and that's really cool too.
So she leads the article with this, and it's so right. This kind of modular thinking has done wonders for software, and it enables you to kind of focus on this problem, and then once you've solved it, abstract that away, and then focus on the next problem. And that does wonders for hardware design too. Totally right. It also makes designing a horribly complex badge tremendously easy because everything is arm's length and handshaking at the SAO connector, and there's nothing easier than an SAO connector. Except getting those stupid keyed 6-pin male versions, which are just hella expensive.
I said the real takeaway is that headers are awesome. Everyone should use headers for everything. And if you can get somebody else to do the modules for you, it's even better. If you can convince a bunch of attendees to make the modules for you, your job is suddenly much easier.
All right, well, that wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you see anything cool or do anything cool, drop us a line, tips@hackaday.com. And to follow the links, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
All good? What do I want to say? A 3D printed open source WH32C003. Let your finger off the damn button.
That's a shirt too.